Hi, friends. Welcome to Moments to Ponder. This is a podcast designed to help you journey through God's Word, gain fresh perspectives, and find meaningful takeaways to ponder throughout your week. I'm Betsy Marvin, and this is episode 108. Waiting is an interesting thing, isn't it? When we know what we're waiting for, it's almost easier than when it's unknown. For instance, when I wait in a line for a roller coaster, I choose to stand there because I know how long I'll stand there and I know that the end of the line will result in a really great ride. But when I'm sitting in a waiting room or waiting on an answer and I don't know when it will come or how it will end, it's so much harder. An hour for a roller coaster seems to go faster than 15 minutes of wondering. As we continue with our story of Joseph, we find him in Genesis 41 sitting in prison. And verse 1 says this, 2 full years later. 2 full years. Not 20 months, not 21, but 2 full years. And because Joseph had no idea when his prison sentence would end or if it would even end, it must have felt so much longer. Waiting seems to be a part of almost everyone's story, doesn't it? When we go through something and we bring our request to God, or we're sitting in limbo, we're waiting on a diagnosis, and we often feel like we wait much longer than we should. Definitely longer than we would like to. We want God to act in our time frame, and that's just not how it works. It looks like the good that Joseph did for the butler isn't going to be rewarded at all as he sits in prison. But in chapter 41, everything is about to change. Now, this is a lot of story to cover in one podcast together, so we're going to move fairly quickly and apply it as we go. So let's dive in. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then, he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. You know that feeling when you wake up with a start, maybe even sitting straight up, trying to get your bearings? Your heart is racing. You can feel the sweat as you try to slow down your breathing with, it's just a dream. It was just a dream. That's Pharaoh in this moment. But he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dream, not one of them could tell him what they meant. These are some interesting dreams, seeing cows eat other cows or somehow grain eating other grain. It would be disturbing. Obviously, this isn't realistic, but dreams rarely are. One thing I discovered is that double dreams were a thing that were noted in Egyptian journals. They were seen as a kind of warning. Pharaoh would have taken these double dreams to be some kind of message. So he called in his magicians and wise men, but they couldn't tell him a thing, which, of course, is God's work. Let's continue. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us each of what our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Okay, finally, the butler speaks. Yet somehow, this is right on time for what God had in store. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means, but I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It's beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Joseph is cleaned up and brought to Pharaoh, and we can hear in his response that Joseph has learned quite a bit since he had his dreams at 17. He points to God, proclaiming God's power to interpret dreams. Now, this would have been a perfect time to push an agenda or make a deal to get out of prison, but Joseph doesn't do that. It's been 13 years since Joseph was sold into slavery. 13 years since he saw his father, since he had freedom. But he has been learning leadership, integrity, and character in various places under unfair and unjust circumstances. And in this moment before Pharaoh, Joseph doesn't plead his case or even cast stones. He just offers to be a conduit for God. There's a verse in Romans. It's chapter 8, verse 28, and it's one of my favorites. It says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. God works in all things for the good. The verse doesn't give a time frame, but it does say in all things. So even for Joseph, after 13 years of slavery and false accusations, God is working. But it's important that we realize this isn't the full meaning of that verse. We need some context by also looking at verse 29. So let's read them together. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. The purpose of us all, what we're all called to, is to become conformed to the image of his Son, Jesus. Just as God has been developing and working to transform Joseph into a child of his, a man who is honest and kind, a servant and a leader, a man of integrity and character, he has been working, and conforming takes time. This is the work in us that brings good. God's work in us, helping us become more like Jesus. And as we conform to his will and grow in him, we transform. Now, this takes time, and only God knows the extent of that time. Even the verse of the day as I record this is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in our confident hope. Be patient in trouble and keep on praying. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says it this way. All of us who have had that veil removed can see and reflect the glory of God. And the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. This is what's been going on for Joseph. Joseph, who has grown more and more like Jesus long before Jesus even came. And God has been at work setting the stage for a moment when the good would come to fruition. I think it's important to say that we may not always get to see the good. But when we look back, someone will see it. Now, Pharaoh retells his dream, and then we'll continue in verse 25. So after Pharaoh retells the dream, Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I've described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward, there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen. The dream is so specific in its interpretation. 7 amazing years and then 7 hard famine years. I'm sure there's significance in the number 7 used here, but what really hits me is this comment. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. I mean, how true is that? Have you ever been really sick and thought, I don't even remember what it feels like to be healthy? And it's honestly only been 3 or 4 days. I mean, we are so quick to forget all the good when something bad happens. The bad seems to color all the good with a big brush of gray. But Joseph goes on. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man to put in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so that there will be food in the cities. That way, there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Joseph has gone from interpreting the dream to giving Pharaoh advice, which seems a little forward for a slave. But Joseph has learned a lot about administrative work and planning in his time with Potiphar and then in prison. In one commentary, it stated, knowledge is information. It tells you what's going on. Wisdom tells you what to do about it. Knowledge is the diagnosis, but wisdom is the cure. Joseph is taking his knowledge and sharing the wisdom that he has from God, and Pharaoh is wise enough to recognize it. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? That's a pretty big statement by Pharaoh, recognizing God's Spirit in Joseph. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Okay, step back a minute. Here's a slave who has a prison record. He's a Hebrew. He's a nobody. And in this one moment, Pharaoh puts him in the highest seat he can hold. I mean, this is nuts when you think about it. The men of Pharaoh's court must have been gobsmacked by all this. All the political maneuvering they might have been in is erased in one moment as Joseph comes out seemingly from nowhere and brings this. I know this isn't seen as a miracle moment, but maybe it should be. Verse 41. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command, and wherever Joseph went, the command shouted, Kneel down! So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh. but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. This is a major shift. Think about Joseph's life up till now. He was stripped of his coat, and now he's being given fine linen. He was put in chains, and now he has one of gold. All of his worth had been taken from him as he became a slave, and now he's being given the signet ring of the king. Joseph is seeing God's plans come into fruition. His dreams as a 17-year-old are beginning to take shape. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphar, the prince of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. Joseph is given a new Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, which means God speaks and he lives. So every time someone says his name for the rest of his life, they will be recognizing God's work in him and Pharaoh's support of that work. It's also interesting to note that he was 30 years old, and we'll come back to that later. Verse 47. As predicted, for 7 years the land produced bumper crops. During those years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was just too much to measure. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of grief. Joseph is given a wife, and I've spoken of this before. As I've done more reading on her, Asenath, the legends of her in Jewish writing point to her being Potiphar's daughter. But then I read another legend that said that she was the daughter of Dinah and Shechem and adopted by Potiphar the priest. So we can't really know. But what we do see is that they have children, and they're given Hebrew names. Through these names, we can see that although Joseph was given an Egyptian name, he still saw himself as a Hebrew, and he would raise his sons in the way of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their names are significant. Manasseh, which means forgetting, and Ephraim, whose name means fruitful. The order is important. Forgetting is a part of the process we need to go through in order to look forward. We need forgetting before we become fruitful. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, he describes hell as a place where no one forgets and no one forgives. But in heaven, everything becomes new, allowing growth and hope, fruitfulness. So for Joseph, he's saying he has moved forward as he forgets the grievances he has with his family, and he moves forward into the life God has given him, seeing all of the good and becoming fruitful in that. Verse 53. At last, the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began just as Joseph predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt, there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well. And when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. Such a large part of Genesis is given to the story of Joseph, and I I wonder if that's due in large part to God using this story as a foreshadowing of the story of Jesus. There are so many parallels. Just as Joseph was taken at 30 years old from obscurity in prison to prominence in Egypt very quickly, Jesus moved from the obscurity of Nazareth to the prominence that he had beginning at 30 years old. Joseph was God's messenger to Pharaoh. Jesus is God's messenger to us, and both spoke truth of the future. Joseph was given the authority to speak on Pharaoh's behalf in order to save the people. Jesus spoke with God's authority in order to show us the way, the truth, and the life. And Joseph provided grain, bread, which was the sustainer of life for the Egyptians in this time. We know that Jesus is the bread of life, the giver of life. Joseph would save his people and many others from death due to the famine. And Jesus would save us all from eternal death due to sin. Okay, that's a lot to take in. That's chapter 41. So what do we take from this chunk of Joseph's story? I think we'll all have something different, but for me, there's a lot in the waiting and the purpose of it that hit me. I can be so impatient. I wonder when God is going to do something to answer my prayer or bring the result I'm looking for. And he's just saying, trust me. I'm working all things for good in my perfect timing, not yours. Which reminds me of Romans 12:12. Rejoice in our confident hope. Be patient in trouble and keep on praying. As we wait, remember the purpose in this all is to help us transform and become more like Christ, more like the character we're seeing in Joseph in this time. Patient, walking with God, being a conduit of his work, a person of honesty and integrity. And if Jesus can wait on God's timing before he stepped into public ministry, and Joseph can sit in prison and wait on God's timing and still trust that God is at work, how can I do any less as I seek him in my waiting? Dear one, are you in a season of waiting? Have you been watching and looking for God to answer something that you've asked or that you're looking for, and he just doesn't seem to be coming through? In the waiting and in the asking, don't lose sight of Jesus. He is at work in you and for you. He wants to conform you to become more like him, and in his timing, he will answer. And maybe as you listen today, you're in a season of seeing the good come after a time of waiting or a time of hard. Praise God for that. Don't lose sight of Jesus just because it's good now. In 1 Corinthians 3:18, we're reminded that the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. God is at work in us, working all things to the good. Yet his purpose is to make us more and more like him. May we be patient in that process. Amen.